The first semester of my sophomore year went quickly. While I spent a lot of time with Emily, I often took my studies with me when I did. She didn't mind. It was my presence more than anything she wanted. I finished this semester with higher grades than I had the previous semester, probably because I felt I needed to set a good example for the men in my squadron. Then came the Christmas break trip. Emily and I flew directly to Huntington rather than flying into Columbus, since we were going from there to England and needed to save as much time as possible. Flying directly to Huntington gave us 6 extra hours to do this. Mom actually organized a party with the guests at the bed and breakfast, as well as everyone else who could come. Bobby and Guthrie, Birch and Stan, Uncle Star and Sarah, Wally Wolven, they were all there. Lots of questions about how we met. Then my dad asked a particularly interesting question.
So, Emily, what first attracted you to my son?
Oh, it was when I first saw him on the bus. He was just so cute.
I was not expecting that. Everyone turned to look at me, wondering how I would react. I mean, what could I say?
Oh, for crying out loud!
Yeah, after all these years, I had to accept the fact that even as an adult, people think I'm cute. Only Emily could have done that. We had our traditional Christmas ham dinner and the next day flew to England. Emily's family had prepared another dinner for us with all the traditional British fare, goose and plum pudding in particular. Never had either of those before. I was rather surprised to find out that they had hoped Emily found someone in the U.S. since she wasn't all that interested when she was at home. Yeah, seems she was destined for me, too. Just as in Huntington, they gave us a lot of advice and told each of us the inner secrets of the other, much to our embarrassment. And, of course, they brought out the baby pictures. Then it was Emily's mother's turn to ask an interesting question.
Dipper, have you bought the wedding rings yet?
Actually, no. We're still a few months away from the wedding, and I sure as heck did not want to lose them in the meantime.
Oh, good.
She then presented me with a small box. Inside was a ring, a plain gold band.
This was my mother's wedding band. If your family has a similar one, you could get the jeweler to melt them together into a new set of wedding rings for you and Emily.
I was shocked. I then immediately called Dad.
Draper Residence.
Dad, it's Dipper. Do you know if we have an old wedding ring from one of my ancestors?
I'd need to check. Why?
I explained the gift I was just given and the idea of what to do with it. Dad thought it was such a great idea that he'd let me know as soon as possible. Later that day, he called back and said that my grandmother Suzanne Orson had left hers and Grandpa Hank's. My Uncle Stargazer was more than happy to save them for me. I did manage to reserve a day at the Academy Chapel in April. I got the rings melded in March and asked the jeweler to hold on to them for us. The day came, and I was nervous. This was a huge step and would change me for the rest of my life. I was a bit surprised, though, that just prior to the ceremony, my dad and my granddad took me aside. Yep, Granddad was confined to a wheelchair now, but he was thankfully still alive.
Grandson, you have no idea how proud I am of you, but I want you to promise me something.
What's that?
When your cubs get to be school age, put in a request for a permanent assignment. Somewhere where they can grow up and have a father coming home every day. And if they don't grant it, resign.
Resign?
No, he's right, son. An Air Force career is admirable, but your family must come first. You know how it affected your Uncle Birch, and I never realized just how much you needed me until I was assigned to Afghanistan.
Yeah, now that Birch's secrets were known in the family, I could see where my granddad regrets his decision and how much my own dad's presence affected me. Good thing my Uncle Star was there. I was still taken aback by Granddad's advice. I mean, he was all Air Force, and now it seems he regrets it. I would have to take that to heart. You're both right, and I promise. It might mean settling down in England, though.
Doesn't matter, son. You're an adult. Your family is more important.
The chapel was packed. I had helped to fly in a lot of friends and relatives, of course. It cost me a lot, but this was important. Besides Mom and Dad and my grandparents, my Uncle Star and his family, as well as Birch and Stan were there, Bobby's parents, Wally and his father, and that was only a small part of the crowd. Lots of fellow cadets. My entire squadron was there, as well as members of my former squadron, including Lieutenant Zim and General Frankel. That was a big surprise. The ceremony was planned out by Emily and her parents in accordance with their religious traditions. I was really rather struck by them. It was all centered on the couple, not the bride. First, instead of the groom being at the altar and the bride coming down the aisle, we were both escorted down the aisle by our parents. Me and Mom and Dad on the right, Emily and her parents on the left. The entire center aisle was flanked on either side with cadets with raised sabers forming a bit of an arch for us. The aisle was too wide for the sabers to actually cross. When we got to the altar, we were allowed to join hands, and our parents went to the front row pews. Bobby was to my immediate right, with a huge grin on his face, looking very dapper in his tuxedo. A bit of a contrast to the other three ushers on his right, Lyqua, Jefferson, and Simmons in their dress blues. Emily had two co-workers and her childhood friend as the maid of honor to her left. The officiators were a couple dressed in white robes flown in from England. We both bowed to them in a show of respect. Then they offered a small cup of wine to Emily, much like a communion cup. We turned to face each other and bowed. Emily drank half the cup, then handed it to me to drink the rest. Then we were sprinkled with holy water. By this time, I was getting goosebumps. Emily, I could feel, was trembling. Bobby produced the rings and handed them to the officiators. They said a blessing over them and handed each of us the ring for the other. I placed Emily's on her hand first, then she placed mine on me. Taking each other's hands, we then recited the vows that we had been practicing for days.
I, Emily Elizabeth
Draper,
Evans, in the presence of God, take thee,
Emily
Dipper
Elizabeth
Donald
Evans,
Draper, to be my lawful wedded
wife,
husband, from now to eternity, and to give you my eternal loyalty, trust, and love.
I promise to raise our children in the values we both hold. I promise to live for you as you live for me, and together live for the sake of others. As an individual and as a couple, I promise to love all people as God's children, even our enemies, as we were commanded to do, and to love our world as eternal husband and wife. Make of our hands one hand, make of our hearts one heart, make of our vows one last vow, even death won't part us now.
Make of our lives one life, day after day, one life. Now it begins, now we start. One hand, one heart. Death won't part us now.
We then bowed to each other and faced the officiators.
By the power vested in us by God, we now pronounce you eternal husband and wife.